Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait a few minutes until we have everybody on board. We're about halfway there. Going to wait one more minute here, about 30 more seconds, and we'll get ready to start. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kelly-Detwiler. I'm the owner of Buttonwood Books and Toys, and I would like to welcome all our viewers who I know are from all over the country tonight. And I hope that many of you are in the comfort of some nice energy-efficient air conditioning. And as you know, Buttonwood Books and Toys is located in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and we are currently under some storm threats tonight. So we're hoping we don't get tossed offline. And it seems somewhat coincidental to have a heat wave and a storm threat, the two vulnerabilities often discussed in The Energy Switch, which is our featured book tonight. It is very special to introduce our two hosts this evening, Peter Kelly-Detwiler and Samantha Woods. Buttonwood loves to pair individuals who have a shared passion, and we couldn't think of a better duo than having Peter and Samantha in conversation together. Samantha has nearly 20 years at the helm of the North and South River Watershed Association, and she has been a steward of our local river and ecosystems on the South Shores of Massachusetts, providing guidance, advocacy, and positive changes to protect our waterways. If you are local to our area, make sure that you visit the NSRWA website for the list of their programs and events. There's some great summer lineups, including our featured authors paddle this coming weekend. And as an owner of a bookstore, I often have the pleasure of introducing authors, but tonight's introduction is extra special. Peter is also my brother-in-law, and I'm so proud to celebrate the publication of his book, The Energy Switch, which will be officially for sale next Tuesday, June 15th. The store will also be hosting a live book launch for Peter next Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. So if you're local, please pop by, grab a signed copy, or you can order a copy online, and we're happy to ship anything to your home. For many of you who know Peter, he's a passionate storyteller, and it wasn't much of a surprise that he would write a book someday compiling his 30 years of experience and knowledge of energy systems and technology. That being said, it isn't easy to publish a book, and I often saw Peter during his writing journey when he was launching his shell or paddling in the North River during our COVID lockdown. He would often relate that he just wrote 2 chapters, and he would give me a couple of his sound bites. And as an author, he never seemed too frustrated by the task of writing a book. He would often say, you know, the words just tumbled out of my mind onto the page. It's because Peter's investment of knowing all the current trends, the people in the research makes him a natural to write this book. What Peter has done so effectively with those sound bites is to weave a ton of content that is relevant to the professionals vested in the energy domain, but to also connect the dots for people like me who are newbies and new to the context of those technologies. He's giving us a lot to think about and a lot of hope for solutions to many of the issues that we're facing. Tonight, Sam and Peter are going to discuss the book for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes available for question and answer. And I totally encourage you to submit questions to the Q&A box down at the bottom right screen. And hope you enjoy the discussion tonight. And I'm going to let Peter and Samantha go for it.
Thank you. Well, Samantha, fire away.
Well, hello, Peter. Been a while since I've seen you. How are you doing?
Quite well. I'm looking forward to the paddle this weekend.
Good, good. Yes, for those who don't know, Peter is paddling 72 miles with 9 other crazy people from the North River to Narragansett Bay, and doing it all to help protect our waters. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can go to our website. And hopefully Peter will make it back in one piece without too much poison ivy or ticks. So Peter, first of all, I want to say I've read about half of the book. So I don't want you to tell me the end, although I kind of want to know what happens, of course. And I just want to say the first thing, that I noticed about this book is how well the storytelling is. It's a pretty, it could be a dry subject, and you've electrified it.
Ooh,
You,
nice.
ooh. I thought it was really well written. I really enjoyed it. And I knew you were a good writer because, you always wrote so beautifully for the newsletter when you were president of the Watershed. But writing a book is a whole nother story. And you did a wonderful job of bringing to life this change that's really happening in the energy industry. And I'm really excited for you to tell me a little bit more about what's the big story here? What's the book about?
So at the highest level, humanity is undergoing the biggest transformation it's ever tried to accomplish collectively, which dwarfs the Industrial Revolution. We're trying to leave the hydrocarbon behind in the next 30 years. That's the source of energy that has propelled all of our well-being up until now. It's been the energy driving our economy. And now suddenly we've got to make this massive and relatively rapid pivot to this new emerging energy economy at a global level, which involves people, training, technology, business models, 100 and maybe $30 trillion worth of investment over the next 30 years. So big picture, that's all going on. The question then is, how does that affect every single one of us? What's our role to play? How do we view this transition? How do we think about it as participants and also as observers? And what I wanted to do was put that all into context.
Yeah, like I said, really fascinating. I learned so much already from the book about sort of the behind the scenes around the energy industry and how it works. And so one of the questions I want to ask you is, who are you trying to tell this story to? Who's your intended reader for the book?
Yeah, I get that question frequently. And I have to say, honestly, the first person I wrote that book for was me 10 years ago. I've been in the energy industry for 20 years. I headed up the second largest organization in the world that drove demand response, which is paying people not to use power during periods of peak demand. It'd be like if you had a congested highway and you said to, a third of the drivers, if you get on the road before 6 a.m. or after 8 p.m, I'll pay you for doing that. It's like building a virtual lane on the highway by changing people's behavior. So I was really knowledgeable at that. But then 10 years ago, I popped my head up out of that prairie dog hole of that vertical I was in, started to look around, and you could see solar energy coming and electric vehicles and batteries on the fringes and wind energy. And I thought to myself, how's this all going to come together? And I really wanted to understand as a professional in the space what was going on. Well, then as I started getting into it more and more, I wrote 300 articles for Forbes and so on. I realized, okay, there's a whole sort of onion layer of people that I want to understand this. So it's the 500,000 professionals or more in the space, in the clean energy space, the solar energy installers, the battery people, the financiers, and so on, because they need to understand what happens and how it's all interrelated. Then next was, okay, students, this workforce that's coming out of grad school and college and even high school that needs to contextualize where this is all going and why it's exciting for them to be involved in it and how it matters for them and their kids and their kids' kids. And then I thought, okay, I'm always speaking at conferences trying to talk to multiple levels. Maybe I can also reach the general public who's not exposed to the electron, doesn't have any intention of getting into that space, but does drive by that Tesla every day or the solar panel on the rooftop, or hears about the Tesla Powerwall, or sees the wind turbine off of Hull and knows we're going to have these massive turbines offshore and wants to know what's happening. Can I reach that general curious reader to tell the story for, again, this greatest transformation humanity has ever tried to accomplish?
That's great. one of the things that I kept coming back to as I've been reading it so far, sort of the analogies that I see to water, this sort of decentralized movement. Um, the one of the things that I said that really was interested in is a fact that I read in your book about the power loss across the transmission lines. It kind of blew me away, like how much power is generated but then lost as we transmit it across these transmission lines. I think you said maybe 60%. It was a crazy number.
Yeah.
And how much carbon that was sort of like wasted. Like really. And we have the same problem with water often, leaking pipes, infrastructure, all this infrastructure we built in the, 50s, in, the last 100 years is decaying. And it offers a great opportunity, really, to rethink how the infrastructure that supports modern life can be rethought. So anyways, I keep coming back to that water part because I'm like, every time I think about it, oh yeah, there's a water analogy to the industry of energy.
There actually is, and there's a lot, and energy markets are more developed because they're about the what, the when, the how much, the how long, and at what price. So they're more technically sophisticated. But yeah, they're both systems of systems that deliver a commodity to an end use customer. In one case, you flip a switch and that power wants to run through the line. Same thing, you open up the spigot, the water wants to run out of the tap, right? They're both designed that way. And so, and they both have inherent losses all the way through the system, whether it's evaporation in California's canals or whether it's the energy lost in the generation itself. Your typical gas-fired plant loses 40% of the raw energy converting that to electricity. Then you transmit it and distribute it, there's another 8% loss. Then, God forbid you put it in incandescent light, you're gonna lose 95% more in that light bulb. It's so hot you can't unscrew it, right? Because most of the energy is turned into heat, not into illumination. And all the way through, the interesting irony is the more waste we have in the past or is embedded in the system, the more opportunity there is to mine that waste and create economic value out of it and reduce carbon emissions at the same time.
Right. I mean, it's not just about the environment. It's just about efficiencies. It's about economies of scale. It's about, not just wasting resources.
Exactly.
So why do you think this is an important book to write now? When we've kind of been going through this, but what's going on that's different?
Well, I think, for some time now, we've been hearing about climate change and, could it be real and so on and so forth. And now we're starting to see these really freaky events, these multi-billion-dollar events costing the economy more and more money, not just in the United States, but around the world. And humanity is, I think, running smack into the concept of finitude, that is finite resources, the end of externalizing all these costs, that pollution, water pollution, air pollution, everything. We're now recognizing, oh, we're stuck on this little blue marble. We better figure out how to live here. And this decade that we're living in right now is going to be probably the critical decade for figuring out energy. The Energy Information Administration just put out a report, 2 weeks ago, that said, if we want to keep at this Goldilocks temperature that we live at right now, neither too hot nor too cold, say within 1.5 degrees centigrade, then we have to pretty much stop all investments in hydrocarbon today, and we have to increase our renewables investment by 4 times what we're doing now. And people go, oh, 1.5 degrees, what's that? Plenty of days are hotter and colder than others. But putting that in perspective, if you made the planet cooler by 6 degrees, we'd be back in the Laurentian Ice Age. So that's how much is at stake. So if we go to 3 degrees, 4 degrees, you'll see the droughts in California, what we have today, that's a joke, right? You'll see the Great Plains probably having real difficulty producing the amount of food it does. You'll see economic instability all over the world with climate migrants everywhere. In fact, the Department of Defense looks at climate change and calls it one of the single largest threat multipliers we face as a national security issue. So now we have a view of what that threat represents. starting to see massive flows of money to change that. A lot of the oil companies, the hydrocarbon, except for Exxon, but most of the other, especially the Europeans, are already starting to pivot into this clean energy space, whether it's wind, hydrogen, etc. Electric vehicles are better technology than internal combustion engines. So now is the time to really put the foot on the electric pedal, not the gas pedal, and accelerate what's going on. And that's what you're buying, and it's also what you're doing at the ballot box, because this thing requires a lot of policy. No single individual makes this happen by themselves, but policy combined with human behavior moves that needle. And that's why it's so critical right now. But in order to make that happen, people have to understand contextually what's going on, why it's going on, and what's likely to occur in the future.
Yeah. Well, so I just want to tell you a small little story of my own. I've told you this before, Peter, but I'll tell the audience. So a couple of years ago, I live in Hull. So I actually live right next to the wind turbine. I'm looking at it while we're talking. I love it. I don't have a problem with it. And then, you know, it was getting a little too hot for me, frankly, in the summer times, and I didn't like that. So, and I never had air conditioning, but I really felt like I had to have some. Maybe it's my age. But so I got it, but in order to make myself feel okay about it, I got solar panels and I got a Tesla wall battery. And I got it because I was on the sidelines at my son's soccer game, and I was hanging out with another gentleman from Scituate, actually, whose son was playing soccer. And it was just after we had, remember the storms that took the power out for like a week in Scituate?
Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah, remember you all came to Hull because we have a municipal light plant. But anyways, that was the thing that we were like, you know, we really ought to have some backup power. And I don't want to get a generator because they never work. Engines never work. If you have a boat, you know, it doesn't work unless you run it all the time. So anyways, so we got a Tesla wall battery and we have the solar panels, and now we're, you know, more than 60% self-powered. And I just got my SREC check today. So it was well timed. So it really is happening for people to be able to be self-sufficient in this way. And I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting in your storytelling was about how people can become a sort of decentralized virtual power plants. To me, this was so interesting. And I thought, wow, that's a great model for how we could be more resilient, how individuals can be part of the solution, and it benefits them personally.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing that happened. I'm going to play moderator for a minute, since I do it a lot of times.
Mhm.
And sometimes in the world, people use jargon, and you just did.
Oh.
SREC
Oh,
check.
sorry. Yeah,
You
what's an
get a
SREC? I don't
credit.
even know what it is. They just
It's
send
a
me money.
solar renewable energy credit check, and you get a payment, as do I, because I have solar panels 30 miles away, but I own title to them. And you get X cents per kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour that your rooftop solar generates as part of the state policy to make that happen. So one of the things about this industry that's so challenging is there's just tons of jargon. The phenomenon that Samantha's referring to, you all see it because we drive by them every day. We see solar panels on people's rooftops. And what those really are, they're miniature power plants. And what's happening is, as the cost of solar panels fall, first of all, there's one chapter in the book where I interview this guy. His job is to torture solar panels. He puts them through 800 thermal cycles, freezing, heating up, to break down the plastics and the polymers and everything to see if they'll last 25 years in the field. He's telling me these panels are getting 0.5% better every single year, and the costs are falling considerably. Solar panel costs have fallen by almost 90% in the last decade because of the behemoth Chinese industry pushing these things. In fact, there's one company in China called Longi that made more solar panels than were installed in all the United States last year. So as the costs fall, more and more people who are in your situation want to deal with, you know, climate change, want to self-supply in outages. They're starting to put more and more of these resources on the rooftops and in their garages. Now, one of the problems right now is it's usually better educated people who have higher income brackets who live in homes to start with. If you're in an apartment, you can't do it. Part of the challenge is in this decentralization movement is to democratize across the whole system. So it's not just rich people with Teslas who can own electric vehicles. It's not just, and so there are things like community solar, where instead of your 20 panels on your rooftop, there's 3,000 panels in a field. In fact, I own the output of 5 panels in Rehoboth, 40 miles away. And that spins my meter backwards the same way your panels on your roof do. So there are now all these opportunities for people to participate in the grid in ways they couldn't 5 or 10 years ago. The grid is starting to become something that Edison wouldn't recognize. Take a classic example. So I was in Maui a month ago, and Hawaiian Electric Company just happened to have released its annual sustainability report. And they serve 3 islands, one of them is Maui. Maui, the renewable energy now is 50.8% of all the electricity produced on the island comes from renewables. And the interesting thing is 22% of that comes from customer rooftop solar and now batteries. And they're the postcard from the edge. Things in Hawaii and California are sort of leading the pack. Australia too, in parts, they have 2 million rooftops that are solarized in Australia. So there are these data points around the world. This is what I look to all the time. Like, where are these first pockets of things happening? And then how quickly do they sort of bleed into other markets because the business models get better, the costs fall, customers get more familiar with them. The same sort of thing that we're seeing now with electric vehicles, like Ford announces the F-150 is now electrified for the first time.
It's a game changer.
That's when you know. And so
Yeah.
this vehicle, the Ford, for example, you can plug that bad boy in at Gillette Stadium where the Patriots play. And some of you sometimes win a Super Bowl, but usually it's ours. And when we go to the AFC Championship, because the Super Bowl is always somewhere else, and party, you have an F-150 with the frunk, you put in your UBS, you have 9.3 volts, you put your sound system up there, you have your George Foreman grill, and you could also run all your power tools. And if you have an outage, by the way, that vehicle, the low-end one, can power your average home for 3 days, high-end 5 days from the car.
Yeah.
This is how things are starting to evolve in the system right now. The balance of power is shifting dramatically.
I think if I lived in Texas, I'd be buying one of those quick.
Yeah, we actually, if we had, so 1 out of every 5 vehicles in the United States is a Ford F-150.
Mhm.
And Texas, if you've ever driven down there, every second thing on the road is a pickup truck. If all those vehicles had been electrified, there's a good chance that a lot of people wouldn't have died because they would have had electricity. Neighbors could have at least gone to the homes that were supplied by power.
Right. Yep. Okay. So next question. What's your favorite story from the book? You have a lot of different places that you're visiting, or at least Zooming, and depending on when you were talking to them. Tell me what your favorite story is out of the book.
Yeah, there were so many. The cool thing about the stories was, there's a lot of technically dense stuff in the book. So I wanted to ride on the backs of people's stories as sort of the on-ramp into the technical conversations. And one of my favorites was right here in Charlestown, Massachusetts, the Wind Technology Testing Center, where they take these blades. They designed the shed in 2011. It's a 90-meter shed, so football field sized. Back then, the longest wind blade was 50 meters or so. And so they designed the shed for 90 meters. They have 165 foot of rebar and concrete in the ground because what they do is they attach the blade to the wall, weighs tons. They vibrate it 1 million times in one direction, 2 million times on another with strain gauges. So it's like an EKG. And they're looking at the sine waves, looking for signs of fatigue in these massive wind blades. And then at the end, they crank them down with steel cables and implode them, essentially, explode them. And they film it all with high-res cameras. And then all that helps them make better blades because these things have to last for 20 or 30 years. So I'd been there, 4 years ago, and I came back for that this spring, just pre-COVID. And they have a blade in there now from GE. And I had a chance to talk to the GE guys as well. And I walked in and I was like, where's the end of the blade? And they said, well, it's a 107-meter blade for a 12 megawatt turbine, which is 8 times the size of the local wind turbine here and 4 times, I think, the size of the one you have in Hull, because I think yours is like 3. And they had to saw off the last 100 feet, last 30 meters or so of that turbine because these things have gotten so big. And to give you a sense, this one offshore machine, this 12 megawatt machine, one revolution would power your house for a whole day.
Wow.
That's how big these are. And they're just getting started. I said to the guy, okay, so you built the shed too small. He goes, yeah, nobody knew how fast this was going to grow and how the technology got better. And I said, well, what's next? And he goes, oh, so right now our turbines are fixed to the ocean floor. That's the East Coast because we have a continental shelf. West Coast and further off Europe, we have to float these guys. Now, floating machines with a fixed structure, if you got a gale or a hurricane going at it, that fixed structure has to absorb all the stresses imparted by the environmental forces. Once you float it and you just tether it to the bottom of the ocean floor with a weight, now most of those stresses are imparted to the water itself. So he said, we think these things could be 2 times, maybe 3 times bigger. We don't even know how big to build the next testing shed. We might have to do it in segments, or might have to all be virtual at some point. That's how fast this thing is changing.
Wow. Yeah, one of the stories that you talked about was the New Bedford port. I thought that was really interesting too, just because it, historically has been associated with whaling and the oil from whales that lit the world. And now, there's this transformation, industrial transformation that could take place and really be a game changer for New Bedford in terms of bringing new industry. I thought that was one of my favorite stories because my dad's from New Bedford.
Yeah, it's interesting to see these places being reincarnated. So next door is Brayton Point, which is a 1,600 megawatt coal plant. They imploded that thing, and now that's the offshore staging ground, probably for the wind industry, competing a little bit with New Bedford. And New Bedford, yeah, it was the energy capital of the world. That city lit the world, and it was the wind and the sails of those ships that drove them to the far corners of the earth. And now it's the wind itself that's the fuel we seek. So
it's a lot of symmetry.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. And the one thing I've found in the course of my last 10 years of investigation is that the pace of innovation is increasing. One of my other fun stories was visiting the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory with a supercomputer named Corey, named after the first American female scientist to win the Nobel Prize. And Corey's this array of Cray supercomputers, and she's pretty fast. I mean, she does 30 quadrillion calculations per second, so she's nothing to sneeze at.
A little better than me.
Yeah. And what Corey does is, if you want a better, like a smooth glass panel on a solar panel so that dust and particulates would slide off at a nano level, like snow off of a cold windshield, you ask Corey to go in and figure out the chemistry, the actual molecules, the compounds at a nano level that could be that smooth, or the leading edge of the wind turbine, that the blade that flows through the air at 200 miles an hour at the tip and gets pitted by dust, insects, hail, and wind. Well, what if I want a more impervious surface? So you go to Corey, the programmer sets up the code for you, and then Corey runs into the periodic table for about a week and screams through all the different possible permutations and comes back with a rank order list of molecules. And now 22 nations around the world are involved in this process of discerning the possibilities. And in fact, there's so many people querying the data, they had to put that out on the web because they didn't have enough, computing power for that. And so the speed of that's happening. And I went into the next room to Corey at Lawrence in Berkeley, and there's this huge cavern there. And I'm like, what's this for? And they looked at me like I was an idiot, which is arguably justifiable, and said, oh, this is for Perlmutter. I said, what's Perlmutter? They said, well, Corey's 30 quadrillion calcs per second. Perlmutter is going to be 3 or 4 times that fast. It also models the Big Bang and other cool, not the TV show, but other cool things like that. So, and then once you figure out what that molecule or compound is, well, now you've got to make it, right? And if I said to you, oh, I want this thing, you'd say, well, I don't know what the recipe is. It's never been made before in the world. So in the old days, it would take 2 years to make these new compounds. Well, now they have robots doing it. And the beautiful thing about robots is they don't unionize, they don't get tired, but most of all, they don't feel shame. And so in our old world, scientists only published their successes, and you couldn't learn from the failures, which is the most valuable part of scientific research. In the new world, the robots that are synthesizing lay down their tracks of failure. And those, as Dr. Kristen Person said, nobody's ever published the scientific journal of failures. But now we can query that data that also helps us to triangulate faster and get at better stuff. So it's happening all across the world right now, these processes of acceleration of technology.
That's a great story. I love the idea of a journal of failures in science. As an environmental advocate, lots of failures happen before the successes that we tout, right?
Oh, they're the building block for them all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, so, okay, you were writing this just over the last year, right? Is this is now being
Yeah.
published, and we're just coming out of COVID. So what was it like writing this book that you were, in the middle of a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic?
Well, like with most people, that kind of came on us. We saw the videos of them spraying the streets in Wuhan, thinking that's not coming here. And I had visits lined up, for example, to GE's turbine headquarters in Schenectady, where I talked to 10 of their top turbine engineers for 7 hours. And that was in March. And then I was at NEC, which was a battery place in Westboro, Mass. And I got to NEC in the first week of March, I think. And when I came in there, the receptionist said to me, "You need to sign an attestation. You haven't been out of the country for the last month." And I said, "Why?" And she goes, "Because we want to make sure you haven't been exposed to COVID." And I was like, "Well, what if I had?" And she goes, "Well, then you're not coming in the building." I should have gone home and shorted my whole investment portfolio that day, sold everything, but I didn't. But the breaks, I had a visit lined up to go to Cherbourg, France, to GE's LM Wind facility to see when they were going to join the two halves of 107 meter, the two clamshell halves of the blade. It was all lined up. And then I was going to go to Rotterdam to see this monster in the harbor, the prototype spinning. All that got put paid by COVID. Well, so then luckily Zoom's the next thing. So I just, after about a month of just freaking out and feeling rather disconsolate and trying, like we all were in so many different ways, I figured, all right, got to keep this conversation going. So I started lining up these conversations on Zoom. So my favorite one there was, there's this guy who lives in New York, but he's in his mother's room in Los Alamogordos, New Mexico, in her garage. And he's building this wireless charging for your vehicle. And it looks like this, only twice the size, right? It's a reinforced aluminum pad with a wire to it. And he's got his Nissan Leaf and he drives in over this pad till he gets right over it. And then that charges his vehicle without touching the car. The same way our electric toothbrushes charge without any cord in them, right? It's the magnetic pulse. And so I was able to watch him drive the car in. He climbed under the car with his camera and showed me the underneath while we're on the Zoom call. And so the conversation kept on going. I was talking to some guy in the middle of fires in California, and he takes his cell phone and he holds it outside, and the sky is this sort of dreadful lemon yellow, as I describe it in the book. And then he goes outside and he says, "But I'm doing fine because I got my solar panels." Then he walked and showed me his power wall in the garage. And on the panels, he traced his finger across and it was covered with soot and so on. In fact, the output dipped the next day or two. But the stories kept on going because humanity kept going.
Yeah, it actually is true. Humans are incredibly adaptable, and obviously you were able to, thankfully, get to talk to people and continue the storytelling, which is such a powerful way for people to learn. And that's, again, part of why I really like this book. Each chapter is like a story unto itself, and it brings you in and draws you in a way that is really personal. And so I really appreciate that, because I think that speaks to a lot of people when they're reading. So what was the biggest, just besides the pandemic, what was the biggest surprise you had during the process of writing this book?
No, there were two of them. One is, Kathy said it, that the words flowed easily. Well, they did telling the stories. They didn't when it came to the harder work of doing the footnotes. I've got 50 pages of footnotes, and they're to spare the general reader who doesn't want to geek out on energy. They can follow the stories, and then if they really want to go into the data, they can go there. Figuring out how to organize it, what the right stories were, which ones were going to resonate, which ones maybe not, and just how to set the whole thing up. That was kind of a challenge. The greatest surprise, though, was when I first announced I had the contract on LinkedIn. I have some followers, but not that many. I had 27,000 views about this book on LinkedIn, which is way orders of magnitude bigger than anything I've ever posted. And when I finally got all the chapters drafted, I went onto LinkedIn and I said, okay, here are my 15 chapters or whatever the number is. And here are the titles and here's the subject matter. You all know this stuff way better than I do. Rip it to shreds and show me where I've made the mistakes. And I had hands raised all over the place. So I sent out all the chapters to subject matter experts because I knew I was going to step in a cow patty in more than one place. And sure enough, I got stuff back from people saying, oh, you didn't quite get this concept right, or you need to update this information here. And so the surprise to me was at a certain point, it wasn't my book anymore. It was our book. I mean, all the errors are mine. So is the revenue, which is a good thing. But really, it became this large collective effort at some level because I think the people in this industry and sustainability are so passionate about what they do. They're smart, they're dedicated, they're passionate, and they're really anxious to have this story told and for the general public to explain what we're doing and why it's so critically important for the future of humanity and all the creatures that live on the planet with us. It's not just us.
Well, I think that there's a real demand for this, a thirst for this kind of knowledge. When I'm at parties and I talk to people about my solar panels or my Tesla Wabell, I get my little app out and show them, it's pretty sexy. I get to be kind of the cool man for the minute, So that I do think that there's a lot of real interest. People want to do the right thing if they can afford to. They want to figure out what the right thing is. And I think that your book is going to help open eyes around that they can be part of the solution. In fact, they have to be, that we all have to be if we're going to make this, as you say, sort of monumental shift. So, to that point, what should we, the potential reader, take away from this? What can we learn from reading this book that you'd like us to take away with?
I think the real critical thing to understand is those of you who are old enough to remember Jimmy Carter, back in the old days, sustainability was about wearing the cardigan and shivering in the dark in front of a fire, right? And getting to some kind of a climate neutral situation was going to be all about sacrifice and changing behavior. And some of that, don't get me wrong, is still probably necessary if we really look in the mirror and face the challenge head on. But at the same time, it's becoming abundantly clear that there's room for optimism in ways there wasn't just 10 years ago. I mean, the solar industry, to all intents and purposes, 11 years ago, we had 500 megawatts of solar installed, and now it's about 100,000 megawatts. And again, those costs have fallen by 90%. So every time we open the toolbox, the tools are shinier, more powerful, and they're cheaper. And so for the first time ever, just in the last few years, you can look into that box and say, oh, we actually have the technology to do this. Now it's a question of the political will and the investments and that sort of thing. But at this point, we can no longer say there's not cause for optimism because it can be done. Now it's about whether we want to or not and making some hard decisions. So, the main thing as a takeaway, I would say if you're a consumer, which is a word I hate, because it means we just go through stuff and consume it all and spit it out the other end. If you are somebody who buys things you need for your life, like that next car or whatever, it's really important to start to look at these new technologies and figure out which ones might make sense for you in ways they didn't before. And sort of lean into this technological change and try and figure it out and be more aware of it contextually, what's going on, why it's going on. Maybe it doesn't make sense to buy that car now. Maybe the costs are going to get cheaper 2 years from now. Wait, those sorts of things. So that's the big picture, is there's room for optimism and there's room for us to play in this because the whole thing is democratizing in a way that it simply wasn't a decade ago.
We definitely just have to keep making it easier for people to take the right choices, and they will make them, I think. As I said, I think they're hungry for it. All right, well, so we are at almost 7:40, which is it. We're so well timed here. This is like it's almost like we planned it.
Yeah.
So we're ready for questions. I think there's some in the Q&A if you are ready to field some of those, Peter.
I've got a few here. Oh, one last thing I will end with on that. So Mary Powell, who's one of my heroes in this space, she was the CEO of Green Mountain Power. She wasn't an engineer. She actually came from the creative arts. And she's always preaching, we have to come at this from a sense of abundance. And she even uses the word love, right? So I think there's that sense of possibility and hope and love we have to actually bring to this conversation. Love for for ourselves, for our children, for people we don't even know. Like that's how big this thing is at a spiritual level and also the economic, environmental level, so on and so forth. So here are some questions. First one, what are the technological advances or organizational processes need to minimize the loss of energy during power line transmission process, or conversely maximize transmission efficiency? Well, the first thing you do is focus all the way down at the end of the line, at the end use. Because if you can reduce that, if you can make that thing twice as efficient, what that means is all the way up the chain, you're cutting those losses by 50%, all the way up, right? Because of the way that system works. So first thing is you focus on putting in the LED lights, the more efficient space heaters, air conditioners, that sort of thing. So that's step one. Step two then is there are certain inherent losses just because of the physics of transmission lines and so on and so forth. But even there, for example, there are now HVDC, high voltage direct current lines, which are capable of moving power long distances without the losses we had before. Liquid nitrogen lines, we can do that sort of thing as well. It's all comes down to cost. But always, efficiency is always the most cost-effective solution. Start there, and then you work your way up through the system and the chain.
Well, I'll just say one thing about that, Peter. You know, the thing is too, though, that carbon has to be priced.
Yes.
Because if it's free to lose it, then it's not incentivized.
Well, it's the same thing. If you had a slaughterhouse dumping stuff into the North River and didn't have to pay a price for pollution, right? Essentially, everybody else is writing the check for that. And that's what's going on right now with carbon, with particulates emissions. They're not free. Somebody's paying that price, whether it's in the form of asthma or future degradation, crop losses, poor quality of life, and so on and so forth. An externality means literally it is not priced into the economics of today's system. Carbon pricing would do that. So New York, for example, is now looking at its organized power market and putting a social cost of carbon into the pricing system so that they're trying to estimate what's the value to society of reducing a ton of carbon, and therefore what price should we assign to that, and integrating that into the market function so less carbon intensive resources would bid in a lower price, and therefore they would get selected first, and the nastier stuff would be pulled in only when it's necessary. So you're absolutely right. There's that whole part of the equation too, which creates more economic structural efficiency.
Same as water. Water's too cheap. So,
yep, it is.
But I'll let us continue down our questions here.
So next question, the possible impact of Biden's clean energy infrastructure plan. There's a whole host of possibilities. Everything from just today, they come up with a new report, or yesterday, on how to deal with the critical minerals, the cobalt, the lithium, the nickel, all those things that are necessary for electromobility, to neodymium and things that are needed in the magnets, in the wind turbines, et cetera. Then they've been looking at educational programs for a skilled workforce. I mean, this administration has taken a very holistic view of how all these pieces need to fit. And I'm a huge fan because a lot of people that I used to interact with as professionals in the space in companies are now working in the administration. So they understand this stuff backwards, sideways, and four ways, whatever I mean to say there, and backwards, forwards, and sideways. And then, you know, Biden's looking at getting all kinds of electric vehicle chargers into place, which are absolutely necessary for the adoption of electromobility, potentially carbon pricing. The list goes on and on and on. More subsidies for wind and solar, so they're on a more level playing field with the polluting hydrocarbons, which have been subsidized for a long time. Forget the emissions. They've been getting subsidies. There are billions of oil and gas boreholes that have never been capped. That is, the drillers walked away and left those costs to be borne by society. Another externality, right? So they've taken a holistic view. They're trying to integrate all these pieces and create a cohesive plan moving forward, which is really challenging. But my hat is off to them for trying to make that happen. Let's see, what else do we have? The biggest barrier, the question, what's the biggest barrier? Technology, economics, policy, society. Oh, Brett. Brett used to work for me, Brett Feldman. Great demand response and end use practitioner. And Brett, come on. It's all of the above. Check A, B, C, D. At the end of the day, though, it's society. we have to decide as people what we want for ourselves and for our children and our children's children. And if we put the right value in the right places, the rest of it follows. Next question, if one wanted to explore the possibility of putting solar panels for the roof, where would one start? To plug a specific company, you know, we have the lendingtree.com for mortgages where you go on and you find all the different mortgage rates. There's a company called Energy Sage. And if you put on your address, you'll get 4 or 5 quotes, certainly in a market like Massachusetts. I know Sloan lives in Kentucky, so maybe the prices aren't as good there, but essentially it allows you to shop different offers, and it includes tax credits and the whole thing. And that lets you compare apples to oranges or apples to apples in a way that's really hard to do if you're out there buying on your own. So I'd start at a place like Energy Sage, and then they'll get all these different solutions providers to give you quotes. Let's see, thoughts about geothermal energy. So geothermal energy right now, the geothermal energy most people focus on today is where there's hot rock, where there are actually geological formations, where magma is close to the Earth's surface. In Iceland, they've actually tried to drill down into the magma, into the actual stuff. And it's a problem because it's acidic and it's ruining the drill bits and they can't get quite close enough, but it's in a supercritical form where it's neither liquid nor gas down there. That's how far down they're going. But for the most part, we're tapping into volcanic areas down in Guatemala or the western part of the United States. Now, though, there's this geothermal process where they're drilling down using horizontal drilling, fracking technology, running sideways, coming back up again, and they're going to pump fluid down, which ultimately will become its own self-pumping system because as it warms, it wants to rise. And the idea is to harvest the natural heat of the earth, like a mile down, and just have a constantly running loop with the hot water coming up and spinning a turbine and generating electricity. And then there's something Google just did with a company for 5 megawatts at a data center out in Nevada, which is a smaller, really cutting edge geothermal technology, small plant, but could also offer some new geothermal. And then finally, there's geothermal for heating people's homes and businesses where you're just drilling down, taking advantage of the 50 degrees roughly Earth's heat and using that to either cool your house or warm it because of the Earth's thermal inertia, if you will. So there's a lot of different forms of geothermal out there right now. The typical one is small though.
Is that the same as heat pumps?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Ground source heat pumps. Yep.
So I just throwing this out here as a little personal story. I just bought a dryer that has a heat pump.
Ooh.
And you know what it does? It creates water out of it. So it takes it's a Miele, we have the Germans. So it was expensive.
Yeah.
No doubt. But it's supposed to last for 30 years as opposed to the 7-year life cycle of my other dryers. And so you take the clothes, you put them in the dryer, it has the heat pump, and you have a reservoir that fills with the water that comes out of your clothes. And then I water my plants with that.
That's cool.
It is pretty cool. Anyways, heat pump. I think the heat pump thing sounds really interesting.
Heat pumps have some real potential. Here's another question. What's the story that hasn't been written that you're most excited about? What's coming in the future that's extra interesting? And you're not allowed to say blockchain or hydrogen. Oh, wow. I've been effectively neutered. Actually, the thing I'm most excited about is vehicle to grid technology. Norway in May, so just happened, 60.4% of all the vehicles sold in Norway were pure electrics, with the Ford Mustang leading the charge.
Yes.
And if you count their plugins, you know, the cars that run 30 miles on electric and then switch over to gas, they were over 80%, right? Wow. UK's numbers are now off the charts, et cetera. So if you take the United States vehicle fleet, we sell roughly 17 million vehicles a year here. Took the whole fleet, let's say we electrified it all within the next 10 years, even 15. If we did that, we would have roughly 30% of all the electricity in this country, if all those batteries were fully charged, rolling around or parked at people's homes. And the average car is utilization factor is about 3 or 4%. The rest of the time it's parked. So what that means is you have this enormous fleet of batteries all over the United States, sitting there potentially doing nothing. So what's happening now is companies like Volkswagen have said next year, every single one of their cars will be vehicle to grid capable. That is, it can flow energy back into the grid from the vehicle. The first things those will do is short-term duration stuff like frequency regulation, keeping the grid at the 60 hertz, the power quality we need. Texas was, by the way, 4 seconds away. Well, it was a short distance away from having the whole grid go down if they'd had their outage that lasted a lot longer because they were under frequency. Cars can solve that problem. As we add more and more batteries to the vehicle fleet, they'll be able to actually provide more balancing capability to the grid. So for example, in California, where there's too much sunlight in the middle of the day that the grid can't absorb it all, and in fact, Australia, there was so much sunlight in the first quarter of this year that wholesale power prices were 1.2 cents negative for the hours from 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. So 5 hours every day, someone was paying you to take power. So you could have charged your car in the middle of the day, every single day, and driven not only for free, you would have basically had your cake and been paid to have eaten it. So if we now have a vehicle to grid capability, and they're doing it with like 30 buses in North London, Volkswagen said they're going to have hundreds of thousands of megawatt hours that they intend to interact with the grid and sell services, which will buy the cost down of people's cars. Montgomery County, Maryland just leased 326 school buses that will be vehicle to grid capable. Kids will run in the morning from 6 to 9. Buses will sit there from 9 until 1. And during that period of time, which is the peak period for air conditioning, that sort of thing, they can release energy back into the grid. So now we'll have these fleets of batteries that are capable of creating more efficiency across the grid. So that's something I'm really excited about, figuring out how transportation and transmission essentially collide in the years to come. That one's going to be interesting to watch. Next question, any thoughts about the status of battery storage technology? Yeah, so the first thing to understand is that the lithium ion technology, even though it's not the best technology, rules the electric industry because of the electric vehicle industry, because 90% of all the lithium ion batteries in the world, and China's announcing a new gigafactory the size of Elon Musk's every week. We're doing it about every 2 to 3 months right now in the US. So all these batteries are coming online and they're dedicated to transportation. They're light. Lithium is one of the lightest elements in the world, right? So that's why that went into vehicles, because you don't want to carry around all this weight. Well, as the costs come down, those now start to migrate into the power grid. As the volumes increase, more investment comes in, drives the cost down, increases the demand. The next thing that happens is the R&D community starts to get involved, whether it's those supercomputers like Cori, whether it's contemporary AmpereX technology, the Chinese largest battery company in the world that announced a year and a half ago. They have broken ground on a 40-acre research facility with 1,000 scientists with PhDs in material science, making new stuff in batteries, right? So the whole battery storage space just gets better and better and better. And ultimately it will bifurcate into more stable, cheaper technologies for the grid and lighter stuff for transportation. And then the other thing that's going to be critical to pay attention to, as these first generation of vehicles come off the roads, it's kind of like a tsunami. You have the earthquake now, the wave comes a short 10 years. You sell the vehicle today, it runs 150,000 miles. After 10 years, it's off the road. That battery still has 80 to 90% of its life in it, which means it's perfectly useful and suitable for adoption in the power grid. And it's already happening. There's a stadium in Amsterdam called Johan Cruyff Stadium where Ajax, the football team, plays. And they have hundreds of Nissan Leaf battery packs, used ones and new, combined together to offer energy to the stadium whenever the power goes out, and also sell services to the grid. So there's this whole secondary market, which will cost probably 40 cents on the dollar for these used batteries, which will also start to be flooding into the grid in meaningful quantities in about 3 years. Right now, most of them in the pilot stage.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. Next question, have I come out of the experience more optimistic about our collective ability to adapt to the changes, and will the US be a leader? Come out of the experience more optimistic about our collective ability. I'm very concerned about the ability of the US to be the leader, because China, for example, not to paint every, people as, well, I mean, let's face it, this is a global competition for economic dominance. China has a combination of, they play Go, we play checkers, right? So China's looking at a 20 to 25-year vision. They understand the emerging energy economy is all about electromobility, batteries, clean. So they make 90% or some number like that of all the solar panels in the world, and they dominate in the battery space as well. And we haven't onshored anything to speak of. We only have one major solar company called First Solar, which isn't even the dominant technology of crystal silicon photovoltaics, which we all see on our rooftops. So my biggest concern there is, like, for example, when we roll back our vehicle efficiency standards, we're basically telling our industry, be as dumb as you want to be and let the Chinese take over and dominate the entire global transportation industry, because we're too, I'll say it, stupid to play the long game, which is what we have to be doing strategically to ensure the possibility for economic dominance. So this isn't just all like, economic, or I should say bleeding heart liberalism. This is real pragmatic drive, strategic drive to maintain some kind of supremacy in the global economy as it evolves. And that's one thing I'm really concerned about. We have to be thinking strategically the same way we do with our military endeavors. That's kind of a critical piece. Next question, only 2% of the vehicles in the US are electric. How do we get to 10, 15, 20? The first thing is you got to electrify the F-150, which we just did. All kinds of new models are coming out and the costs are starting to fall. Still, like, one great thing about the F-150 is the low end of that is $40,000. So that's within shooting range of people who buy pickup trucks now, right? So we got to get the cost down. That vehicle, by the way, can go 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds. Not that anyone's going to be able to do that without getting pulled over, but how cool is it? That technology is better than your internal combustion engine. You got to put the chargers in. You got to have some policy right now with subsidies to help adoption, but ultimately it will stand on its own. Let's see. I think we have one last question. Let's see. What are we going to say? Am I confident the federal government will step in and help fund the infrastructure needed to further development of these new energy advances? Well, right now we're on the fence on that, right? There's a lot of conversation right now between the various parties in terms of what's going to happen. I'm not sure exactly, but if we don't figure it out, we ultimately will end up paying the economic price. I mean, the climate change is a critical thing, but just again, in terms of economic competitiveness, we got to do that just to maintain some kind of relevance in the global economy. So with that, I thank you all for the questions. I know there's a lot more here. I couldn't get to them all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter and Samantha. You guys are terrific. And I imagine we could sit here for a lot longer tonight, but I can honestly say I have finished Peter's book, and these questions and more will be so answered. He's got great pictures in the book. Some of the things that he's shared tonight, he's taken some great photos so that it gives you an idea of the scope and size of some of the things he's been talking about. And really, this is a good book to move us forward. I hope that you can think about buying it from Buttonwood Books and Toys or your local independent bookstore. I want to thank you all for joining us. And for those who are local, please come by, meet Peter in person next Tuesday. And thanks again. This will be recorded and up on the Buttonwood website in a day. So thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Peter. Great talking to you.